Hello, welcome to the Basis Project. I think we're calling it Basis 76. Now, like a lot of things...
I didn't realize I was being recorded today.
Yeah, well, we're doing a record, and
Okay.
but an intro, right?
Okay.
So,
Okay.
do explain where you are, but it looks beautiful.
I'm in Oregon.
Oh,
I'm in the West Coast. It's about 1:30 now. It's fiery, smoky, but yeah, the light here is nice. I've just moved into this house, so I'm in that stage where the walls are still empty, and I love it.
it actually looks great. And I have to say, you've got a decent mic. I mean, I'm actually completely overwhelmed here. This is just fantastic. And it makes a huge difference when you do that, just so others know. Well, do introduce yourself. This is. I feel terrible about this because I think you first started messaging me about a year ago.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
And I did a thing called reply. I know it's dreadful, but there it is. So, well, tell us more. Or tell us more. Will you go on? Please tell us more.
Okay. Thank you. Gosh, I'm living a double life. I've been living a double life since I was a kid, essentially. I was born into a family that was living a double life. My mother was a poet, artist, secret mystic, and my father was an atheist, scientist, very absolutist atheist who he was out to convert the world to atheism. So anyway, I grew up with this polarity and without history and without my mother and father, they didn't teach me history. I didn't know I was Jewish. I didn't know that anything about religion. And but I must be an old soul or something because I have memories going back to when I was a baby. And a lot of my early childhood memories were actually very mystical, very psychical. And I converted to Christianity when I was 11 and had lots of mystical experiences, which my parents basically disowned me. Both of them disowned me when I was a kid. So because I was having these psychical experiences. And I was saying, this is me, right? So this was like I was born in 1956 in California. My father, by the way, was the inventor of he was an electrical engineer. He worked on early television. He worked on early radio. He invented the first answering machine that was popularly used in the 70s. So I grew up with a very sort of nuts and bolts, hammers and nails, saws, lathes kind of experience with him. So what I'm trying to get to is that I always felt drawn on the one hand to, how when you have a lot of childhood wounds, your life is kind of about healing your childhood wounds. So on my mother's side, why couldn't she accept being a mother? And on my father's side, why was he so, I would say, tyrannical in his atheism? And to the point that he actually didn't speak to me for 20 years. Because I wasn't following in his footsteps. So anyway, what eventually happened was I became a mother and I experienced low milk supply. I was doing yoga, I was a musician, I have a degree in music, and I was living in Switzerland. And when I experienced low milk supply, and then I discovered that there was this whole realm of herbalism and diet that were used by women for thousands of years around the world, I became so intrigued, and it was kind of like healing the wound of the mother, healing the wound of our civilization that has distanced itself from its roots, from its understanding of the importance of food, of rhythm, of heart-to-heart connection. And I began to research that, and basically I researched it for 15 years and published a book, Motherhood, which kind of made a big splash at the time. Today, you can go online and look up lactogenic foods and herbs, and it's everywhere. Everyone knows that foods and herbs support breastfeeding now, and that you can build your milk supply with diet, among other things. So when I made the decision to go into developing this knowledge about the foods and the herbs and the breastfeeding for mothers, I distanced myself from my spiritual side, but my spiritual side had been really my guiding light since a child. And eventually I assumed a pseudonym and was able to write up some of the more important experiences that I had had with spirituality. And those books kind of took off, have had a life of their own, and I began to feel that, and I was never able to live my whole self, because on the one hand I had my psychical world, and on the other hand I had my mother counseling world, and if I wanted to be respected in the health realm, which is very important. You can't come off as a woo person if you want to be respected, by doctors and nurses, etc., which my work is respected. You had to hide this side of yourself.
Well, so, I think one woman who's really managed to do that is Mary Rodwell in Australia. I think she's managed to bridge that gap, but continue.
Right. So, both aspects of what I do are a kind of a bridge, to use that word. When I was 17 years old, I was introduced to a meditation teacher, and I started to have huge breakthroughs at that time. I started to see auras, became very psychically sensitive, and was introduced to this amazing teacher who taught a kind of meditation that takes energy into the body, opens up the chakras at different levels, and actually expands the aura and solidifies, evolves, I don't know the right word to use, the energy system, so that it's possible to go up, as it were, and actually to send the psychical self up different levels. And I would say that that's called the RoseWay meditation. I would say that using the RoseWay meditation, people are able to have experiential experiences of God, or of expanded consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, telepathy, remote viewing, healing, working with energies. And I developed this system then when I went to Europe and I was studying music, and this was in the mid-'70s, and there wasn't very much available in Europe at that time as far as like meditation teachers. And I really wanted to continue learning, but because there was no one to learn from, I began to teach. And when I began to teach, I began to develop a whole system and realize how the RoseWay meditation could be used to help people who don't have kind of access to those sides of themselves to get it very quickly. It's almost like if you want to, people say they take LSD and they have a breakthrough experience of God, or they take ayahuasca or whatever. The RoseWay meditation is kind of like that. And, instead of like...
Well, I caution taking any drugs, because it does poison the inner eye. And it gives you false experiences. It doesn't really give you the real deal. So explain what all this is.
You have to ask a more direct question right now.
What is the Rosemary meditation? What exactly does that involve? I mean, you've found a route into finding this higher consciousness, and so how does that work? And I certainly agree with you about Europe. I think in this country, in this current era, there's a wonderful woman called Sue Allen in England who assists in courses and things. But please explain your pathway to this.
That's right. So at that time, in the 70s, there were people in England in particular who were doing all kinds of healing and psychic work. But there was very little, let's say, there was people doing it in the Alps, in little enclaves. But it wasn't like today where you can go on websites. So or there are like teachings that are being published and practiced. And so anyway, I was really guided to this teacher. I mean, everything is a story. Nothing came in my life that was anything less than magical, which I know that you have a lot of the people that you know have that experience.
Well, this is truly wonderful. I'm enjoying this so much. I mean, your pathway and how you find it is giving me a great deal of satisfaction.
Thank you. Yeah. Right. So I spent a lot of time in my early 20s trying to decide what is the ego, what is the self, what is the spiritual self, all of these things. And I've kind of left all of that. I don't think that that's very important for me personally, for the way that I hold my own experience. I had some conflicts that I'd like to tell you about, though. So after I had been teaching the RoseWay meditation, and I taught it in Basel, and I taught it to through the Parapsychology Association of Basel. And then I met Hans Bender in Germany, and I taught the RoseWay meditation at his institute for a while. And now,
because of, is this anything to do with rosemary beads that the Catholic would use? Is it any connection that way at all?
And in a way it is, because the man who taught the RoseWay meditation, his name was Joe Kapersky. And I actually wrote a book about the RoseWay meditation that you can find on Amazon. And I describe, he was a Christian and Catholic background, and he was a psychic working in Los Angeles in the 60s. He didn't want to be a psychic. It's kind of like he was propelled into it through a series of events, and he pulled away from it because he didn't like being used by spirits. And then finally someone came through who said, I won't use you. I will be connected to you, and I will teach and evolve with you, but you won't actually be a medium. And this was a higher teacher, a Chinese teacher called Lu Sen. And Lu Sen taught Joe the RoseWay meditation. And Joe would open his house 3 evenings a week and 1 morning. And those sessions lasted 3.5 hours each time. And you had anywhere from 10 to 30 people doing this together, which was very powerful, because when you expand your auras together, it creates a tremendous vortex. And so when you kind of go up together, it was just an extraordinary experience. And we would do, it's called the opening phase of the RoseWay meditation, in which first you invite God's light, and there's an invocation, a kind of a prayer, and then the light enters your body from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet.
Now, what do you call God? I mean, it's a severely tainted ideology now with what we've seen going through the established religions, the 3D world, authoritarian organized religions. But is this source, or what would you describe that as? How would you really say that?
Well, in my books that, again, I publish under the name pseudonym Dana Williams, I go into this and I say I'm going to use the word God because it's how Joe used it, and because I feel that we have so many shadow sides associated with the word God, right? So if we stay with it, we can purify it. Yeah.
I mean, this is very different. I mean, in Ireland, we had a comedian called Dave Allen, and he would always end his comedian shows, which is very clever. May your God go with you. But right. I'm so disheartened with the way things have worked out in Ireland with these horrible cults who've taken over Christianity. Now, you've converted to Christianity. In what brought you from where you were to that, to therefore use what we're talking about?
Well, yes. Okay, so I was 10 years old when my parents divorced. And I was crying one day in school, and a couple of kids from class caught up with me on the way home and befriended me. And one of the girls, she was the sixth child of a Lutheran pastor. And basically their family adopted me. I became the seventh child. And I experienced Christian family life in a very loving, supportive way. And I would go to church every Sunday then with them. And, I'd look at the pastor and he was always talking about love. He didn't do any of that fire and brimstone stuff. It was not fear-based. And he said, God is like a father, and we should feel free to communicate, to cry, to seek comfort, to seek consultation with our inner God. And what that did for me was it started an inner communication. So I learned at a very young age how to both send out kind of a message to the higher spheres, as it were, or to God, and to be receptive and humble and to wait for what came back to me. And I think this is something that's really missing. I like Jordan Peterson very much. I don't know if you know of him, but
from the point of view of an audience, when you mention somebody like that, maybe if you could help so if people want to find out more about that particular individual, you could suggest something which would help people find out.
He's on YouTube. He has a channel, and he's providing a very interesting counterpoint to today's conversations. And one of the things that he says is, I believe it's him, is that through prayer, he's a Canadian professor. And I think of him as the Carl Jung of today. He's bringing everything into one system, and then he's evolving it further in a way that we can understand it in terms of today's science, our neurology, our psychology, what we understand truly about sociology, genetics, etc. And one of the things that he says is that in prayer, we take that moment to turn inwards with a question, and we pause, and we are with ourselves. And today, when we're so much with our screens, we're no longer with ourselves, right? And also, we feel people grow up under so much subliminal and not subliminal, more overt directives of how they're supposed to think and act, and what's acceptable and not acceptable. So we're acting according to programs. We're becoming programmed. That's something you talk about a lot. And instead of having those deep inward moments with ourselves where we really discover our humanity and also our spiritual connection, however it is that you want to define that. So when I use the word God, going back to what you were asking, really I'm just inviting people to explore what that means for them and not saying this is what it is.
Well, I think the main thing is it's not a fear-based God, fire, and damnation. I mean, that's one of the key things. If this is the point, so continue.
Right. Okay. So I learned this system of meditation with Joe, and he would take us up, I'll just put it like that, and open the upper chakras, and he envisioned the higher chakra as a rose, which is why it's called the RoseWay meditation. He actually envisioned it up here. And some people call that the eighth chakra. And in any case, at that point, he would teach us, or we would do exercises, or he taught numerology, astrology, healing. He would do a lot of references to the Bible. And so for me, it was like a crash course. I was 17 years old. I had left home. I was like, this is what I was doing. I was the youngest person in class, and I was, as a young person, the way that you take that in, I was taking it in really fully. And I was studying music at the time privately, and with my lover, who was the musical genius. And it was quite something. And we went together to Europe. And there I sort of thought, well, I'm going to meet my next teacher. And when I didn't, I began to teach. And what I found was that you could make things much more experiential. So, for instance, the energy sheaths that today is quite normal. We understand the magnetism of the body, and when we're a little sensitized, we can feel these things. I was developing with my students a whole series of exercises, different kinds, which was really fascinating. I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by it myself. The fact that I did that in my early 20s.
You've had an amazing journey. You've deparented. You've established your own field, and you've made strides. And when you didn't have a teacher, you became one. This is fantastic.
But what happened then was I discovered that I had overstepped my maturity, that I was not a mature person. At 22, 23, you're not a mature person yet. And so I pulled back. And as I was pulling back, I met Spiritual Master in Switzerland. And again, that's a fantastic story how I met him. But his name is Hugo Meyer. And he lived in India for 17 years in the tradition of Ramana Maharishi. You may know him. And
that's TM, Transcendental Meditation. Yeah.
No. Ramana. He was in Tiruvannamalai, and in the mid-century, he's considered the father of the saints of the 20th century. He's considered the greatest saint of the 20th century. And Hugo had an inner connection to him. He had already, Ramana was already deceased at the time that Hugo was studying. He was a naturopath. And when he had his full enlightenment, he went to India and studied with some of Ramana's followers and became a teacher in his own right. And so I would go up now in Switzerland in the summers and sit in a completely private ashram. Today everybody knows all the ashrams, or it's a cult, or you have to pay all these things that you're talking about. One of the things I noticed right away was that both of my teachers, Joe and Hugo, were voluntary. You paid what you could. There was no fee up front, which is just amazing. You won't find that anywhere today.
Where are these ashrams? What does that mean? What part of Switzerland, for instance?
This was in Wallis, in the southern part of Switzerland, in the Alps. And he just had a house that he lived in. At first, it was just his little house and the people who he'd known for decades before from his childhood in Germany, who then followed him, who were aware of his spiritual development and kind of followed him to India and then came back with him. A lot of them were doctors, priests, and he would come to Switzerland during the summer, and during the winter he'd go to India. And he had a little ashram in India, and gosh, I'm not aware of the name of it, but I can get it to you. You can flash it here. But anyway, yes, it was a very humble thing. It was all about, it's like he didn't want to create a group. He didn't want to create a cult. He was like, if I can bring just, two people through, if I can, help two people fully evolve spiritually, I've done my work. And it was, that would be like a whole thing describing what that was like, to be in his presence.
Well, we can do this in stages and go into great depth. And because you mentioned the uniting energies together, like your biogenic field, is that correct?
Yes. So what Hugo was, though, Hugo was so vast and so deep, and he would just take you to states of quietude and transcendence and peace. It was otherworldly. He was like, and so I realized that there are different paths in spirituality. There are paths where you can consciously evolve your aura, which is what Joe was doing, and go up and be in communication with guides and spirits. And then there's the path which Hugo described, the direct path to self, to source, if you will. And that you go through there's all kinds of, that's more like, today we call that vipassana, because it's like you are with what is, and it evolves, and you get cleared out, and it evolves your character.
Yeah, that's fine. And this is really a wonderful exploration and of pathways and spirituality. How would you like to develop this in terms of how you describe this in interviews?
Well, thank you. I didn't, as I said, I wasn't really aware that we were going to be recording today. So,
Well, it's a sort of an exploration and crash into it. And how do you think we should discuss this? How do you think you want to push this?
one thing that I want. Okay, so I don't know, but in terms of interviews, but I would like to say that my work for mothers and for families is very important. There's so much that is wrong about how women are entering motherhoods and how they're being supported and how children are being supported. And this is really so close to my heart, as I talked about in the beginning, the wound of the mother. What do we think about today? How does civilization be healed? It's healed when at least the initial relationship between the mother and the child works, when at least that breastfeeding, and I say not even the breastfeeding, I mean, that's optimal, but if there's no breastfeeding, and even if there is, the heart-to-heart connection, really the energetic awareness of our sacred being. And afterwards, you can let go easier. I think mothers are so, I think, I wasn't prepared to talk about this, but this is a really big subject on my heart because
this is very important because what's happening is there's the break with there's a huge row happening about childbirth. They want cesarean birth. They don't want natural birth. They're accusing they're attacking the
language.
The whole everything. It could go on. Some of the early first basis conference, we had a couple of very brave individuals who were talking about this, and this is going back to the heart of childbirth and human control and the whole energetics of human beings and life itself. In our spiritual, this is why we've sort of crashed into this, but I think it's really worth it. Sort of calling this sort of an introduction, and then we can develop this because I really want to pursue this in really great detail.
Okay, great, wonderful, thank you. Well, I've written 2 books for mothers. Just a second, right here. This is the first one that I published first in 2004. It's called Motherhood.
Yes.
And it's kind of become a classic. And really, to prepare, all that you have to do is read the reviews on Amazon, because mothers will talk about the various problems that they had that this book helped them solve, and how they felt that this information wasn't available anywhere else. This goes into really key things, because this is all about how our science says what you eat doesn't matter, how you're connected to your environment doesn't matter, and that women should be able to perform things like breastfeeding. The body should do that automatically. It doesn't really need dietary support. Yet women around the world have always supported their breastfeeding experience dietarily, and it's really fascinating because it's even possible that plays into the kind of foods that developed into our crops that we eat every day. In any case, and the other
that's another story. That's getting worse. The chemicals and that 3D chemicals.
Exactly. Oh man.
Yeah.
and the other one that I've written for mothers is called Healing Breastfeeding Grief, because so many women, prepare to breastfeed and then they're not able to, and they go into a profound sense of failure as a mother and devastation. And this isn't being addressed. And it's just a horrible, horrible way to start your motherhood experience. And I've worked with many, many mothers. So I became a certified hypnotherapist a few years ago, and I immediately turned my work towards mothers. So anyway, there's that. And then my spiritual books, I don't know if I have. Oh, yes, I do. So my main one is the RoseWay, and that's on Amazon. All of these are available on Amazon. And this is
now you've got different names there. Is that a different name?
That's right. It's a pseudonym.
Okay.
Because I wanted to keep the 2 worlds separate, so you can put on this like Hilary Jacobson, Dana Williams / Dana Williams. I don't know how else to do it. I mean, I'd really like to bring them together. I'd really like to live a life where I can feel like a whole human being, like I'm not having to separate myself out into different areas.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. I'm really into this. So what I want to do is, this is a really good introduction, and we can then organize, and I'll keep the appointments. I will. I really, 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 really will. Because I've delayed this. Is it a year since you first contacted?
Yes, it is about a year.
Oh God, that's not too bad. God, Jesus. So this is wonderful, Hilary, and we'll get back together and we'll explore. And essentially, how do you feel right now that you'd like to develop this?
You know, I hold all of these pieces with equal reverence and importance. So however you want to go is fine.
Well, we will call this a part 0. So what we could do is develop a part 1, and I'll be guided by the way you want to do this, and
Okay.
and we'll explore that and continue from that. So for the moment, Basis 76 is saying hi to Hilary and bye to Hilary, just for the moment. And
Bye, Miles.
it'll be good to see how the painting and the house develops and things. But this is giving me a really good feeling of, I don't want to go all soppy, but good stuff. Well, for now, we'll just call out a short little hi and get back to you after the bleep. So
Thank you. It's been so nice talking to you. Thank you, Miles. Look forward to it.
Okay.
Okay.
Goodbye for now.
Bye.
Cheerio.
Bye. Cheerio.